Okay, so before we begin, I want to make something perfectly clear up top. I will be using the terms Frankenstein, Frankenstein's monster, and the creature interchangeably when talking about this movie. If I'm referring to Frankenstein the man, I'm going to likely refer to him as Dr. Frankenstein. But in terms of talking about the monster, I'm going to use those three terms interchangeably because that's a perfectly acceptable thing to do. When you talk about Frankenstein, everyone knows that you're talking about Frankenstein the creature. And it is perfectly fine to just refer to him as Frankenstein. I mean, in a lot of the original stage plays, they referred to the monster as Frankenstein, because he is technically the son of a man named Frankenstein. So I just want to make that perfectly clear before we get into this, because a lot of people get really pedantic about this subject and feel the need to interject and say, actually it's Frankenstein's monster. Just call him whatever the you want. Hey everyone, I'm Ben, your underground conductor, and welcome to Underground Cinema. Now, what else is there to say aside from Happy New Year? 2026 is now upon us, and with the coming of this new year, we will have a litany of newly recycled ideas turned into films, including Frankenstein. Again. So I figured in order to prepare for the two upcoming Frankenstein adaptations that we're getting this year, being The Bride and also Frankenstein Romania, as well as also celebrating the fantastic Guillermo del Toro adaptation that came out a couple months ago, I thought it'd be fun to go back and talk about the original Universal Classic, Frankenstein, from 1931, which I rewatched on this beautiful Frankenstein Blu-ray. This Blu-ray actually comes with all 8 Frankenstein films from Universal's classic monster era, and this Blu-ray actually came as part of this gorgeous Blu-ray box set that comes with all 30 of Universal's classic monster movies. The box art on this is absolutely gorgeous. Even the Blu-ray cases are gray instead of blue. Oh, wait a minute. See? It's cool, right? I mean, look at this thing. Anyway, the original Universal Frankenstein film is one of the most iconic films of all time. This film has inspired countless horror movies over the course of nearly a century now. Out of all 30 of Universal's classic monster movies, I would certainly say that this one is the most iconic out of the bunch, even more so than Dracula. And on top of that, I would go as far as saying that Frankenstein is the movie that put Universal on the map as a studio. I mean, even the design of Frankenstein's monster in this movie is just so iconic and recognizable that I would bet that you could go to pretty much any person in any developed country in the world, show them the picture of this creature, and they would recognize it as Frankenstein. I mean, seriously, the design itself is just so unique, and the iconography of it, I would argue, rivals that of a figure like Mickey Mouse or Superman. Everyone knows this design of Frankenstein, from the flat top head, to the electrodes in the neck, to the questionable green skin color. I stress questionable because, as I have claimed before, I am fairly certain that in the original film, the creature's skin color is like a pale flesh tone, since he's supposed to be a reanimated corpse. But there's also a lot of inconsistencies if you look at a lot of the colorized photos of the creature. Like, in some of the photos, he's flesh-colored, but in other photos, he's somewhat of a light gray, while in others, they lean heavily into the green. So, it's kind of unclear exactly what color the original creature was. I mean, it is cited that the makeup artist for this movie, Jack Pierce, used like a blue-green blend to get the specific color of the monster, that way he would look good on camera, since they were shooting in black and white. But it is just very unclear exactly what color he's supposed to be, which is fine. Like, the fact that this movie is black and white lends ambiguity to the creature's appearance and allows the viewer to decide what color the creature is in their mind, which is just one of many positives with this film. Of course, I'm already on a tangent at this point. The thing I'm getting at is that Frankenstein, this version of Frankenstein, is just iconic. And it's really interesting exactly how iconic this film is from a few different perspectives. For one thing, this was not technically the first film adaptation of Frankenstein. The earliest known film adaptation of Frankenstein was the Thomas Edison version from 1910. But putting that aside, another interesting thing to note is how dissimilar this particular film is to the original Mary Shelley novel. Now, as I've mentioned in previous videos, I am an enormous fan of Frankenstein. I saw both this movie and The Bride of Frankenstein when I was a kid, back when you could order the DVDs from Netflix. And I also read the original Mary Shelley novel when I was in middle school. And something that's grown to fascinate me more and more as time has gone on, and as I've seen various other adaptations of Frankenstein, is exactly how different this original Universal film is to the original book. Like, there's just so many differences between this film and the book, and because we've been inundated with over 1,000 adaptations of Frankenstein, it's kind of fascinating that this film, which is the most iconic one, is also arguably one of the ones that's least accurate to the source material. And until recently, I didn't understand why. But on my most recent rewatch of this movie, I delved into a lot of the special features available on this Blu-ray, and I discovered that this film technically is not an adaptation of the original Mary Shelley novel. At least not directly. As it turns out, this film is primarily an adaptation of the Frankenstein stage play, and it blends in a lot of elements between the Peggy Webling stage play adaptation from 1927, as well as the John Balderson stage play, I believe from 1930. So the popularity of those plays, as well as the overlapping inspirations between them, eventually led into the creation of this specific film adaptation of Frankenstein, which would explain why so many elements of this film are not only different from the original novel, but also basically every other adaptation of Frankenstein. It's because it wasn't adapted directly. I mean, if you really think about it, this movie is sort of like the cinematic result of a game of telephone, because it was adapted from a play that was inspired by another play that was then adapted from a book. I mean, in that sense, it's kind of like Zack Snyder's 300, where 300 was adapted from the Frank Miller comic, but the Frank Miller comic was adapted from the 1960s film The 300 Spartans, and The 300 Spartans was obviously adapted from the ancient Greek propaganda story of The 300 Spartans, which was in turn inspired by a true story. You're just going down the chain. And also, while we're on that same subject, the actress that plays Elizabeth in this version of Frankenstein, Mae Clarke, apparently inspired the character of Lorelei Lee, who is Marilyn Monroe's character in Gentlemen Prefer Blondes. And if I'm remembering properly, I believe Lorelei Lee also inspired the Disney version of Tinkerbell in Peter Pan, I think. So that's just another chain. Tangents aside, again, my point is that despite how iconic this film is, I feel like a lot of people don't actually recognize how dissimilar it is from the original source material. And yet, it's iconic nonetheless. And it left me to wonder, why is it so iconic? Because obviously the makeup is phenomenal, but it can't just be that. There has to be something else. And I think what makes this movie so iconic is really its tone, aesthetic, and themes. So with that all in mind, exactly what is Frankenstein about? Well, the story begins how you would expect it to begin. You see Dr. Frankenstein traveling around, collecting parts to create his creature. But as we meet Dr. Frankenstein, this is where the film starts to deviate from the source material, as he is accompanied by a companion called Fritz, who's like sort of this hunchbacked creep, and the character of Fritz does not appear in the original Mary Shelley novel. His character was actually added into this version of the story just so Dr. Frankenstein could have someone to talk to, that way it wouldn't look like he was just talking to himself. And if you look at Fritz very clearly, he is inspired by Quasimodo, who is the main character from The Hunchback of Notre Dame. And interestingly enough, The Hunchback of Notre Dame was published in 1831, which was the same year that Frankenstein was republished with Mary Shelley's name on it, because the original publication from 1818 did not have her name on it. It was published anonymously. And also interestingly, 1831 was exactly 100 years before this movie was released, which is also funny. And also interestingly, Fritz would go on to inspire the Igor Hunchback character, who became a classic staple of mad scientist stories. And there's the tangent again. But Fritz is not part of the original Frankenstein story, and another thing that we find out very quickly is that Dr. Frankenstein in this movie is not called Victor Frankenstein. In this movie, he's called Henry Frankenstein, for some reason. And the character of Victor is reserved for Dr. Frankenstein's friend, who in this story I think is supposed to be the stand-in for Henry Clerval. So a bunch of the names were just swapped around for some reason, and I couldn't tell you why, but once again, several changes from the original source material. In any case, Dr. Frankenstein and Fritz are collecting bodies, and Frankenstein starts to get frustrated because he can't find a corpse with a good brain. So he has Fritz go get a brain for him from the local university. But as Fritz is stealing the brain, it accidentally falls out of his hands and breaks. So he goes back and grabs a second brain, and the second brain is actually of a criminal. It's an abnormal brain, which was a very interesting creative decision for this movie that has been broadly criticized for a lot of reasons, because it sort of juxtaposes poorly with the overall theme of nurture versus nature in this story. That being said, I would also argue that the fact that it is a criminal brain inside of Frankenstein's monster actually adds more nuance to the film, and also goes on to highlight how certain biological forces are not always necessarily deterministic, given how the creature behaves once it's brought to life. But I'll cover the creature's behaviors a bit more later. In any case, Dr. Frankenstein has a brain, creates his creature in front of his concerned fiancé, concerned friend, and concerned former professor, and we get the iconic moment of the creature coming to life, as Dr. Frankenstein screams, "It's alive! It's alive!" Which, it sounds melodramatic and silly, but that line read is one of the most iconic line reads of all time. I would argue that outside of the creature's appearance, that line read is probably the most iconic thing to come out of this movie. But Dr. Frankenstein goes on to bring his creature to life, and then, at roughly the 30-minute mark of the movie, we finally meet the creature face to face, as he stumbles in, walking backwards, for some reason, slowly turning his head to reveal the intricate makeup which was applied by Jack Pierce. And, as I've mentioned already, this makeup is iconic, and is just so incredibly well detailed with the scarring, and the clear discoloration that you can still make out, even though it's in black and white, like dark patches here and there. And Frankenstein even has a concaved cheek, which is just incredibly impressive, and really adds to the idea that this is an animated corpse. And you might be asking yourself, how could a makeup artist create a concaved cheek effect in 1931? Well, as it turns out, Boris Karloff, who played Frankenstein, wore false teeth on one side. And when Jack Pierce found this out, he just told Karloff to take out his false teeth before filming, which is hilarious. But the Frankenstein appearance just looks so good, and it's interesting to note that the final appearance was actually a compromise between the makeup artist Jack Pierce, who crafted every Universal monster, as well as the director James Whale. Apparently, Whale and Pierce went back and forth on the creature's appearance several times, and between the two of them, they settled on this final look, with subtle evolutions leading up to principal photography. And it's a little unclear exactly which aspects of the creature's look were inputs from Pierce as opposed to Whale, but something that is definitively known is that the flat head top was inputted by Jack Pierce, as when he was crafting the creature's appearance, he did a lot of research into corpse decomposition and asked himself, okay, what would an untrained scientist do if he was trying to put a brain in? So in the context of this film, the reason the creature has a flat-topped head is because Frankenstein, as not a trained surgeon, just cut the top off, stuffed the brain in, and then just tried to, close it up. Which is why his head's just completely flat, which is just incredibly interesting. But the way Karloff plays the creature in this movie is just so incredibly subtle, as the monster carries an innate level of curiosity with him, and one of the first things we see him do is actually reach for the light as he's curious about it. And that's a very interesting character detail, is it not only communicates sort of the neutral nature of this creature, but also shows the influence that the creature has from his creator, as Dr. Frankenstein in this story basically created the creature as an exercise in his own curiosity regarding the science of life and death. And the fact that the creature is kind of neutral like this also further highlights the fact that even though he got a criminal brain, that doesn't really matter. This creature was just brought to life, and as far as the movie's concerned, he was basically given a fresh start, and who he eventually becomes may just ultimately be determined by how he's treated by the environment surrounding him. But unfortunately, Dr. Frankenstein is not the only one influencing this creature, as Fritz immediately becomes antagonistic towards the monster. And as the monster receives more and more abuse, the more and more monstrous he becomes. As he then goes on to tussle with his creator, kill Fritz, and then kill Dr. Waldman, who was Dr. Frankenstein's teacher. And going back to the topic of the creature's curiosity, something else I love about Frankenstein's monster in this movie is despite the fact that he has like a toddler-like intelligence, he actually is somewhat clever and is able to respond to things in the world that threaten him. Like the fact that when Fritz is whipping him, he's eventually able to get the whip and hang Fritz by the neck with it, which would imply that he knows how to tie a knot. Hanging him up wouldn't be hard considering how strong the creature is, but he was able to figure out how to tie a knot around someone's neck in order to kill them. That's interesting. And you could say the same thing in the scene where Dr. Waldman was getting ready to basically dismantle the creature. The creature notices that Dr. Waldman is going to start cutting into him, so he pretends to stay asleep and then slowly raises his arm to choke Dr. Waldman to death. Like, that's sneaky and clever. He was basically playing dead to get the upper hand. Literally. So that's just another element of this movie that really plays into the intrigue of the monster, as well as one of the central themes of nature versus nurture. In any case, after committing these various acts of violence, the creature goes on to escape from Frankenstein's laboratory and disturb the local countryside, as he meets a little girl that he takes a playful liking to, but goes on to accidentally kill her. And that is another difference from the book, as that scene with the little girl's death is meant to be substituted for the death of William Frankenstein, Frankenstein's younger brother in the novel. But in any case, the death of this little girl enrages the townspeople and inspires an angry mob to form, as everyone in this town, including Dr. Frankenstein himself, go on to hunt down this creature. And eventually, Dr. Frankenstein does find his creation, but he's no match for his creation's incredible strength, as he is then incapacitated and taken by his creation to a local windmill. It's at this point that we reach the climax of the story, as the creature ascends this windmill tower with a hostage, which is very similar to the climax of King Kong, which came out 2 years after this, only to discard his creator as a hostage, and inevitably get trapped in the windmill as it gets burned down by the townspeople. The creature then goes on to wail in fear and pain as everything burns down around him. The villagers content in their actions as they've come to convince themselves that they've rid their community of a monster. Yet the man who created this so-called monster survives the whole ordeal, which leaves one to question, will this village continue to be safe, or will the sins of Dr. Frankenstein come back to haunt them all? I guess we'll come to see. In any case, though, that is the story of Frankenstein. And while the broad strokes of the plot are the same, there's just so many details that are changed and so many details that are cut out. In fact, if I'm remembering properly, I think the sequel to this film, Bride of Frankenstein, is actually more accurate to the book, which is funny. But regardless of accuracy, exactly how does Frankenstein stack up as a film? Well, it's quite interesting, because I would say that I enjoy this movie much more than I did when I originally saw it. When I saw it originally as a kid, I liked it, but I also felt like it was kind of boring, and I preferred Bride of Frankenstein to it, because I felt like the monster took too long to show up. Which is kind of the case, considering that this is a 70-minute movie, and you don't really see the creature's true appearance until roughly the 30-minute mark, so almost halfway through. But a lot of the Universal Monster movies did the exact same thing, building up suspense until you eventually finally see the monster. I mean, the original Wolfman with Lon Chaney Jr., which I reviewed last year, did exactly that. You don't see Lon Chaney as the Wolfman until like halfway through the movie. So, as an adult, that aspect of Frankenstein doesn't really bother me that much. Especially considering how rich the themes are in this movie. And I think what makes this movie really work is how those themes are communicated through the central character of Dr. Henry Frankenstein. Something that really fascinated me about this movie is the fact that Dr. Frankenstein's character is just so obsessive. And unlike the book, which explains his backstory and motivation, and unlike multiple other film adaptations that do the same, this film doesn't delve too deep into why Frankenstein wants to create life. He just does. And normally I would consider a lack of defined motivation shallow in storytelling, but in this case I think it really works, as this film spends so much time emphasizing how Dr. Frankenstein has sort of this god complex. And it's implied in this film that the natural curiosity that he had in school, paired with the inherent arrogance and ambition that he also has as a character, is what eventually led him to believe that he could conquer death itself and defy God's will. And I think those central character traits, as well as the themes of life and death, and the central philosophical question of whether or not man should pursue greater knowledge, are really well communicated by Henry Frankenstein's actor Colin Clive, who really does a lot of the heavy lifting in this film. I mean, the breakout star of this movie is broadly considered to be Boris Karloff, who plays the creature, and that is true, and he does an excellent job playing the creature, and I want to get more into his performance a bit later. But Boris Karloff in this movie doesn't really appear until roughly the 20-minute mark, when his character's under a sheet getting ready to get brought to life, and you don't really properly meet him until like the 30-minute mark. So for the first half of this movie, you're following Colin Clive as Frankenstein, shambling to bring this creature to life, and trying his damnedest to justify his ambitious desires. And while initially I wasn't super fond of Colin's performance in this movie, I grew to deeply appreciate it, as there's just such a theatrical nature about him, especially in his face. Like, Clive just gives an incredibly expressive performance with his face in this film, and his eyes are just so incredibly striking. And as I thought about him as the film went on, I came to realize that it wasn't his performance that I disliked initially, it was more so the dialogue that he was given, as I felt like it was a little too expositional. But that could also be said for most of the characters in this movie. Looking at it, while I'm not too fond of the dialogue, I think all the actors in this movie do a great job. I think Mae Clarke does a great job as Elizabeth, doing great work elevating a character that isn't too well integrated into this film. Like, Elizabeth isn't a bad character by any stretch of the imagination, but throughout a lot of the film it feels like she has a larger role than she actually does. Of course, you could also say the same thing about Frederick Kerr, who plays Baron Frankenstein, Henry Frankenstein's father. Kerr just does a spectacular job in this movie, and really brings forth a strong comedic presence, but in an appropriate way that complements sort of the somber gothic tone of this film. And his performance is so compelling that it also makes you forget about the fact that he has a massive tumor on the right side of his neck. But he's absolutely hilarious in this film, but much like Elizabeth, it doesn't feel like he's integrated in properly. And the same thing could also be said for Edward Van Sloan, who plays Dr. Waldman in this movie. He also played Van Helsing in the 1931 Dracula with Bela Lugosi. Out of the side characters in this film, I would say that Waldman is probably the one who's best integrated into the plot, and feels like he carries some weight in the narrative, but his role as sort of this guiding moral force for Henry also kind of rings hollow at times. Like, it's really odd, this film is populated by really compelling actors doing great jobs with the characters that they're given and helping them to shine through, but the characters themselves don't feel as well integrated into the plot as they should. And I think you could probably contribute a lot of that to the director of this film, James Wales, who apparently just kept on changing things in the shooting script on the day and making tweaks to the story as he was making the film. Because there's so many things in this movie which are clearly hangovers left behind from the previous script, and they create continuity errors and inconsistencies in the narrative. For example, Baron Frankenstein, when he's introduced in this movie, complains about the fact that his son is held up in the old windmill. Because in the original script, Frankenstein's lab was supposed to be in the windmill, but they changed that and pushed the windmill to the end of the movie. But the line is still there. Another thing to note is that when the father of the little girl wanders into town with her dead body hanging in his arms, he claims that she was murdered by drowning. But he wasn't there to see her drown, so why would he assume that it was murder? Well, as it turns out in the original script, it wasn't the father who left the little girl outside to play by herself. It was the mother. And in the original script, the mother didn't leave into town like the father did. The mother went inside to cook in the kitchen. So in the script, she would have seen her daughter playing with the creature outside, and then the creature throw her into the water. And then she would have gone to tell the townsfolk that her daughter was killed by a monster, which would have made more sense and fed into the town outrage. But, it's just little things here and there that were changed, but there's still dangling threads left behind from the previous versions, which illustrates the fact that this film was kind of sloppily put together, which I feel shitty saying, especially considering that I am a Frankenstein fan, and this is one of the most iconic films ever made, but it's true. The movie's kind of sloppily put together. So the question becomes, why is this film remembered, and why does it work? Well, it's because despite the fact that the narrative is sort of sloppily handled, everything else about the movie is amazing. Like I said, I like this much more than I did when I saw it when I was a kid, and despite its flaws, there's so many other elements of this movie that work. I already mentioned the performances, obviously, but the art design and production design in this film is phenomenal, as most of the architecture and sets are clearly inspired by German expressionist films like The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari and The Man Who Laughs. And Universal clearly got a lot of good use out of their little Europe setup when they were trying to emulate this specific aesthetic style from German filmmaking. This film also has a lot of great visual symbolism. I mean, say what you will of James Whale, but he was a good director. And one of the first things you see in this movie is the character of Henry Frankenstein and his assistant Fritz digging up a freshly buried corpse. And while they're digging it up, Henry Frankenstein literally takes the shovel of dirt and throws it in the face of a statue of the Grim Reaper. He throws dirt in the face of death to illustrate the fact that he doesn't care. He's going to break all the laws of man, nature, and God to get what he wants. The film also has a spectacular sense of build-up. As mentioned, you don't really meet the creature until halfway through the film. So the first half of the movie is just spent building up the idea of, oh, this guy's going to create life. And the creature is just shrouded in so much mystery leading up to his reveal. I mean, even in the opening credits, when you show every actor, when it gets to the credit for the monster, there's just a question mark, which apparently was a reference to the old Frankenstein playbills from the 1823 play, but was also pretty commonplace for Universal. I mean, referring back again to the Wolfman, if you look in the opening credits of that movie, when they get to Lon Chaney as the Wolfman, they credit him as the Wolfman, but you don't see him in the Wolfman makeup, you just see him in his human form. Because these movies always emphasize building up tension and suspense until you get to the reveal of the monster. Like, I made fun of it earlier, the fact that Boris Karloff walked backwards into a room, but that scene is really interestingly directed as he slowly turns around to reveal his appearance. And then, of course, there's the emotional weight in this film, which I didn't expect to buy into as much as I did. Like, I've seen literally hundreds of films in my life, and I've also seen a lot of horror movies, and I've seen just so much disgusting and disturbing stuff that I've kind of become desensitized to a lot of media. And also, because of my innate cynicism, I also sort of roll my eyes when I can tell something is fake. But there's moments in this movie that surprised me as I found them still emotionally effective. Like when the father wanders into town carrying his dead daughter in his arms. It's just one long shot, the father looks distressed, the little girl is as limp as a rag doll, and as he walks by, all the townspeople stop their celebration as they come to notice, oh, this man is carrying a dead child in his arms. It's genuinely upsetting, and is also something I don't feel like you would see in a lot of modern films. And the fact that all the smiles and celebration slowly fades as he walks by, I think is just an excellent bit of directing, and further goes to hammer home, oh yeah, this is a tragedy. And while we're on the subject of tragedies, that also leads us to the conclusion of this movie, which, as mentioned, is very similar to the conclusion of King Kong. But something else that those endings also both have in common is the fact that they are still emotionally effective. In both cases, the monster at hand is confused. And with Boris Karloff specifically, his performance is just so compelling, as in a way, he's kind of just a wounded animal. I mean, his character in this film is really no more intelligent than, like, an infant or a toddler. And all the terrible things that he does in this movie are only in response to terrible things that happen to him, or things that he does by accident. So by the time you get to the end of the movie and he's trapped in the burning windmill, and you just hear Boris Karloff screaming in fear, it comes off as a genuinely sad series of events. And rewatching this film, as they got to the end, and you see the windmill start to burn down, my eyes were glued to the screen, and I started to feel like I was on the verge of tears. Because just seeing this creature, screaming in fear of the fire, as he's scrambling looking for any way out, only to be inevitably crushed by a falling beam, it's genuinely really upsetting and disturbing, and just makes you feel so much sympathy for a creature that didn't really understand what the world around him was. And going into this review, I actually rewatched this film 3 times, and each time, getting to the conclusion, it was the same effect. Just an immense amount of sympathy building up as I watched this confused creature, helpless to save himself. But yeah, say what you will of this film, it's not accurate to the book, it's sort of sloppily put together narratively, and it has some ridiculous stuff in it, like when Dr. Frankenstein falls from the windmill and it's clearly a dummy, and not him. But this film definitely has way more working for it than it doesn't, and I think its status as one of the most iconic films of all time is very much well-deserved. Because really, this film is the reason why Frankenstein ceased being just a story and instead became a legend. But yeah, that was my review of Frankenstein. I hope you all enjoyed it. Please feel free to subscribe if you're feeling generous. You can also follow me on Instagram and Letterboxd if you want to hear more of my film takes. I hope 2026 is going to be a great year for all of us. I mean, it's certainly going to be a great year for Frankenstein. And I will see you all later.